Hello viewers, we are very glad and fortunate that we have Professor Radhavallabh Tripathi in this session with us. Professor Radhavallabh Tripathi is a former Vice Chancellor of Rashtriya Sanskrit Sansthan. Earlier we had discussed with him the traditions specifically in the translation of Indian classics. Sir, we would like to continue from the leaf that we left in the earlier discussion and would specifically focus on the translations of Abhigyanshakuntalam, which is one of the very important classics of the Indian literature. I request Professor Singh to initiate the discussion.
Dear learners, in one of the sessions, Professor Tripathi ji, who is with us, had discussed about translation of Sanskrit classics and a text in the beginning. And therein he had taken a few milestones into consideration. Brihat Katha was one. Then he focused on Panchatantra. Sir, between this 15th, 16th century translations of Sanskrit, particularly I keep in mind Bourgeois' Pahlavi translations of Panchatantra. Then there is another milestone in the form of translations that took place in the court of Akbar, Ramayana translation. And then thereafter in around 1655-56 when Dara Shikoh started, and Dara Shikoh's translations of Upanishads as Sarai Akbar, 52 Upanishads, then they were translated into Latin and other languages, and that is how Europe came to know about India's knowledge contained in Upanishads. In fact, at times, even at the risk of over-enthusiasm, I say that Dara Shikoh was one of the earliest cultural and intellectual ambassadors of India. Right. Thereafter, sir, the milestone is in the last decades of the 18th century, when we find the Gita is translated by Charles Wilkins, and William Jones translates Abhigyanshakuntalam. We would like to know from you about this, the trend that began and how Shakuntala became a name known all over, that even the girls came to be named as Shakuntala in Germany. Yes. The way Goethe received it, and subsequently the rich flow of translation from Sanskrit texts to European languages began the whole 19th century and so on. Period is very wide, sir. So much happened, but we will like to know from you about all these activities in general, but Abhigyanshakuntalam in particular, from William Jones onwards, and quite a few translations that were made.
Before coming to Shakuntala and its importance and the contribution of Shakuntala translations at the global level, I would like to pick up the thread from our earlier discussions. You are very much right about Dara Shikoh. He is not only a great cultural ambassador. Besides translating these 52 Upanishads in his Sirra Akbar, he also wrote a work, Mazmul Bahrain, and he also wrote the same work in Sanskrit, Samudra Sangam. It is not exactly translation, he wrote it originally in Sanskrit. So he envisages the philosophy for this vast peninsula, and because he was here apparent, so he was utilizing his resources for these translations, these Upanishadic resources in philosophy, for his own philosophy as a ruler also. So when these translations of Dara Shikoh reached the West, and West was so much enamored by this Indian philosophy and its depth, the thinking of the seers of Upanishads and the Thoreau and Emerson and Schopenhauer, they appreciated this philosophy. So we were discussing Panchatantra. It was somewhat relegated into the background. But recently, two translations of Panchatantra, very new and fresh translations, they have appeared. One is by Ramsey Wood from USA. He started translating Panchatantra around 1993, and 4 volumes of his translation have come out. The importance of Ramsey Wood's translation is that he is basically a storyteller. He tells stories on TV and media, even in public. So he has utilized Pantantra and its whole cycle of stories, how to tell a story, and his books also. And they are Pantantra is retold through these books and his performances before a contemporary audience. He has recreated the characters. He has shown them into tensions in a contemporary world. The jackals and lions of Pantantra, they make a re-entry into our contemporary world. So through this new translation, Pantantra has again come into forefront. And Chandrarajan,
for the sake of our learners,
yeah,
can we call this translation by Ramsay Wood as a recreation of Panchatantra?
It is actually a recreation of Panchatantra, and it is not translation. Again, as we had discussed, not translation in the modern sense of the term. It is almost the same approach which the Syriac and Arabian translators were having, utilizing the resources for their contemporary world and revisualizing, recreating the whole text. So this is reappearance of
our writers in our regional languages, those who wrote about Ram Katha,
same thing.
Almost a European following Indian tradition.
Right.
Please, sir.
So it's also a kind of form, a different form.
Form also changes.
Because it has and also kind of appropriation, maybe suiting to the
reappropriation of the
local needs and
you are right. So in this context, when translations of Shakuntala or Abhigyanshakuntalam, the magnum opus of great poet Kalidasa, they start coming out, the whole scenario changes, and almost there is a sort of global vibration created through the translation of Abhigyanshakuntala. So as you told about Sir William Jones, he was magistrate in Calcutta, and in 1788 he started translating Abhigyanshakuntala. There is a very interesting story how he learned Sanskrit. We will not go into the details of it. And he was a great scholar. He knew as many as 8 languages: Greek, Latin, Italian, and Arabian, and Persian. So he was an Indologist and a linguist also. So when he came to know of Shakuntala, he had already translated some Dharmashastra books, and because they were utilizing the magistrates in the law courts of in East India Company for judicial purposes, they were utilizing the Dharmashastra books, Manusmriti and other books. So these translations were before them, but they were not introduced to the great classics. It was Sir William Jones who inquired about the tradition of poetry or literary text, and he came to know about Shakuntala and he translated. And the first edition of Sanskrit text of Shakuntal with English translation he published in 1789. That is an event of historical importance, not only in the cultural history but in the whole history of globe, we can say, because it had its echoes all around the world. It had far-reaching consequences. And when this translation reached Germany, as we know, there was a Forster who was involved in the political movement of his country. But when he read this translation, he took it upon himself that even though he doesn't know Sanskrit, he will translate this work from English into German. And in the preface he wrote that I am translating it because I feel that we will need this text when our wounds of the sufferings that our people have undergone, when they are to be healed up, we will need such text, because this is the text, the history, it will be historical necessity for us. When this translation by Forster, as you said, into German, it reached Goethe. He was so much moved by reading Shakuntala. He wrote a very beautiful poem, and in this way Shakuntal or Kalidasa's play made deep inroads into the literary and cultural tradition of Europe, because not only Goethe was deeply influenced by Kalidasa's world of Shakuntala. In his Faust, we see that his vision is somewhat changed. In the very prologue, we see that the whole cosmic vision is there. The gods have appeared on the stage. They are appearing, and the whole treatment of the theme, you see there is a change with his perspective. And when a French translation was sent to him 40 years after he wrote his poem on Shakuntal, he wrote back to the translator that I have the same feeling about Kalidasa Shakuntala that I had 40 years back. So Goethe is such a great literary figure in German literature. Not only Goethe, Schiller was his contemporary, and he also came about Kalidasa and about his Meghdutta. So he wrote a poem in German, Cloud Messenger. So there are some such works in European literature in English and German which speak of influence of Kalidasa, which is evinced through his translations. And it is even presumed that directly, we may not say, indirectly, the whole romantic poetry in English or European language is somewhat influenced by this translation of Kalidasa, Shakuntala and Meghdut, because there are scholars, particularly the European Orientalists, they say that from the day Shakuntal has been translated in a European language, this will be termed as a Shakuntala era. This Raymond Schwab, a French writer, he says, and Lynn Benset-Bodo, a French Indologist, she has been working for many years on Sanskrit drama and theatre. She even sees an indirect relation between French relation and this appearance of French translation of Shakuntala. So, as you said, that they started naming their daughter on the name of Shakuntala. There was a Shakuntala theatre in French. So Kalidasa somehow is seen in the works, in the cultural moorings of these countries. And before Sir William Jones produced his translation of Abhigyanshakuntalam, as you said, Charles Wilkins had already translated Bhagavad Gita, and he had also translated Hitopadesha into English. So all these translations created a different era in the whole global history, not only in India but in Europe also, because the perspectives changed. The perspectives about India and its cultural traditions changed not only in our country, in West also. There are translations by other scholars also in France. The Stragi's translation, it also became very popular, and Kalidasa is regarded as an exemplification of new human values and the movement of romanticism. Coming back to our country, I feel that Kalidasa's play, when it appeared in English translations, this was an event that was very much important in Indian history also, not only in literary history of India but in political history also, because as soon as Sir William Jones translated and published his translation in 1789, there was a Kolkata theatre in Calcutta, and they had been producing Shakespeare's plays, but the same year they produced Abhigyanshakuntalam. So there was a beginning of stage productions of Abhigyanshakuntalam in English, William Jones translation. Then there are performances of Shakuntal in Germany and French, and later on in Chinese opera, Shakuntal is performed. In Japan, it is performed. In so many other countries, Shakuntal is being performed. So as a sort of rediscovery of India, as a sort of rediscovery of human values, and the whole world is enlightened about India and a great classic in a different way through these stage performance. So as we are discussing that we have a different medium for a literary text, the medium of storytelling. It is also there in case of Panchtantra, and the medium of theatre, stage performance, it is there in case of Shakuntal. So when we have a survey of these performances of Abhigyanshakuntalam throughout the world, we see that it is creating a a unique impact throughout the world. So Gerard de Nerval, he presented his adaptation of Kalidasa's play for the French stage around 1845, and in 1858 Gautier adopted Abhigyanshakuntalam in the form of a ballet, which was performed in the Opéra de Paris on 14th of July the same year. So we have this 19th century vibrating with Shakuntal performances. They are having a reflection on the cultural scenario. Then coming back to India again, we see that there is a line of translations in Urdu and Persian also, and in Hindustani and Hindi. So these translations of Abhigyanshakuntal, they are becoming popular on stage also. So the Mirza Qasim Ali Jawa in 1810, he created the first Urdu translation with the help of Pandit Lallu Lal. He was a Braj scholar. He had translated Srimad Bhagavad into Braj. So, and between 1826 to 1975, there have been several Indian editions of this translation by Qasim Ali Jawa. Second translation in Urdu is by Akhtar Hussain. It has been more popular. The introduction by Akhtar Hussain, how he views this play. He says that this play appears to him as an ever blooming flower. Sada bahar phool ki tarah hai ye drama. This is what he says. And he says that I faced great difficulties in rendering this play from Sanskrit into Urdu. It is like rendering a Pandit from Ujjain into a Mirza of Lucknow. So, and I have tried to do that. So we can see the difficulties of translations, the problem of creativity in translation. You see, when it is translated into Urdu and Persian, a different sort of environment is there. So when we see a Persian translation, so the Bhramar and Kalika, the symbols, they change, and it is Shama and Parwana instead of a bee hovering over a bud or flower. So and there are different ethos of poetry is there when it comes into Urdu. Of course, they are very, very, very beautiful and poetic translations in Urdu and Persian of Shakuntal, but the ecology somehow changes. The ethos of the play also, when it is rendered into a different language which has its own very strong cultural traditions and which has its own very beautiful idioms and expressions. So the translations are carried away by their own idioms and expressions of the language. And Akhtar Hussain also says that translating Shakuntala is like the attempt of a dwarf catching a fruit which is far above on a big country. Pranshulabhe Falelo Bad Udbahuri Vamana. He's taken this line from Kalidasa when Kalidasa says that describing the line of Raghuj is like catching a fruit which is far above by the dwarf or Vaman. So,
sir, in this context, our learners would be much benefited to have your views on this count also, that in translation, attitude to the text and author also counts. For instance, when William Jones was translating Abhigyanshakuntalam, though he was a benign colonizer, master, with full respect for Sanskrit, unlike Fitzgerald, who translated Umar Khayyam's Rubaiyat. But it is from his translation it becomes very clear as that William Jones was governed more by Victorian morality.
You are
so
right.
He made changes.
Yeah. This is a very important point.
Whereas Akhtar Hussain ji, he has a kind of a different kind of attitude towards Abhigyanshakuntalam, where he thinks himself as a dwarf and trying to catch that particular branch or a tree at a higher level. So these attitudes in translation and even reception, they also matter a lot, sir.
Yeah, it's a very important point you have raised. Yeah, when the European Indologists, they were translating texts like Shakuntal, you see, they were somehow governed by the Victorian moral sense, and Sir William Jones tried to avoid that scene between Dushyant and Shakuntala in the third act of Shakuntal, which the translators of Urdu and Persian, which they could appreciate because they had this tradition of Asian attitude to life, the frankness of life which we have in the Vedic tradition, in the tradition of Sanskrit literature and Sanskrit classics. They had it in the tradition of Persian poetry, so they could better appreciate Shakuntala. Of course, they had different symbols and different expressions and idioms, but they could render the world of Shakuntal in a different world quite beautifully, keeping the spirit of the original play alive. So, coming to the theatre adaptations, you see, translations and theatre productions, they now go hand in hand. You see, we find that Radheshyam Kathavachak, one of the greatest dramatists writing for Parsi theatre, he was a very renowned scholar, a lover of Hindi, and a great playwright. And that was a time when one play is being produced before the audience of 10,000 persons, and there is a big hue and cry for getting the tickets for the plays like Pathan and Diwar and the plays by the Parsi theatre companies. So in that atmosphere, we find that Shakuntal translated by Radheshyam Kathavachak is being performed. Shakuntal translated by great writers for this Parsi theatre, it is being performed. And finally, these great stalwarts of theatre, Ibrahim Alkaji, you see, he is performing Mohan Rakesh's translation of Abhigyanshakuntalam. Prithviraj Kapoor, when he had the premiere show for his Prithvi Theatre in 1945, he performed Abhigyanshakuntalam rendered into Hindustani by a great playwright of Parsi theatre. And then Adya Rangacharya, the great dramatist of Kannada and theatre personality. Narendra Sharma, a great poet and theatre personality who worked with Uday Shankar's troupe earlier. B.V. Karant, Gotovsky in Poland, Prasanna and Subbanna and Rita Ganguly, Shyamanand Jalan and Sanakya Ivotombi from Manipur. Up to the modern times, there are so many translations and the whole line of theatre performances. So, Shakuntal becomes a text for rediscovery of the Indian theatre, the Indian cultural ethos, and understanding the whole tradition of classics. So, in India also this happened. If we go a little back, we find that Hafiz Muhammad in 1886, when his translation was performed for the Parsi theatre, this Agra Natak Mandali, established by Mirza Nazir Beg, they had so many performances, and finally the event that created a great change in the whole scenario because of this performance by Mirza Beg. Kumar Nazir, who was the proprietor of Victoria Natak Mandali, one of the pioneer theatre companies in those days, so he was touring with his performance of with his production of Shakuntala in between 1874 to 1876 from Calcutta to Kashi, and in so many towns they were performing Kalidasa's play. And at Kashi they performed it on 10th June of 1875. So this performance, you see, became a turning point in the history of Indian theatre, because Bhartendu was in the audience, and his friend Pramat Nath Das, he was also with him. And you see what actually was happening. Parsi theatre was a public theatre. It was a popular theatre. It was songs and dance, and the dancers, the ladies who were earlier working as professionals in some brothels also, they started coming into this Parsi theatre. So the sanctity of the original play was very much marred, vitiated in these performances. And when the actor who was performing Dushyanta, he started dancing by tossing his hips, and he was singing Patli Kamar Bal Khaye, some song like that. So Bhartendu, he rose up and he said that now it has become quite unbearable. These people are butchering Kalidasa. ये लोग तो अब तो सहा नहीं जाता. ये लोग तो कालिदास के गले पर छुरी फेर रहे हैं. These are the words. These are the words quoted because it was a historical moment. On that day, Bhartendu vowed that he will discover what Kalidasa is and what Sanskrit theatre is and what Indian theatre stands for. So then comes the other translations, the translations by Raja Lakshman Singh. There are many other translations by very good authors for theatre performances. And Vrindavan Lal Verma, you see, in 1905, he had seen the performance of Shakuntal translated by Raja Lakshman Singh. In his memoirs he has written, so the whole scenario was changing, you see, because Parsi theatre made its own experimentations with Shakuntal. Now there was a change again, and we see that somehow the whole movement, the movement of Renaissance, even the whole movement of freedom struggle, it was somehow concerned, maybe indirectly, with this discovery of Shakuntal, Kalidasa's play for modern theatre, because we find that there is a state of Jhalawad in Rajasthan, and there is a Maharaja Bhavani Singh. In 1920, he inaugurated his theatre with the performance of Abhigyanshakuntalam. He invited all the kings from the neighborhood. It was a great event, you see. We find that the female roles, they are being played by the male actors. Nanne Khan is playing the role of Shakuntala. The Chote Khan is playing Kanwa, and Mirza Nazir Beg Nazir is performing Dushyanta. So you can see the hidden meanings why these Parsi companies are performing Shakuntal, and what message the king of Jhalawad is trying to deliver through the performance of Shakuntal, and he is having such a big gathering of all the kings from the neighborhood. So in this way Shakuntal becomes much more significant for us, and this significance we can notice when Prithviraj Kapoor, he was a towering figure in theatre and cinema during those days, and when he was to perform a play for his as a debut performance for his Prithvi Theatre on 9th March 1945, he directed himself this Shakuntal. It was translated by Pandit Narayan Prasad Betab. There was a sort of disagreement between Prithviraj Kapoor and Narayan Prasad Betab on the language of translation. Narayan Prasad Betab was a great author for Parsi theatre. He said that I will write in my Hindustani, Urdu mixed language. Prithviraj Kapoor said that because it is a Sanskrit play and we want to create a sort of environment of the original play, let it be Sanskritized language. But Narayan Prasad Betab didn't agree, because he was used to write. He was so popular, you see. These were the days when Radhesham Kathavachak, Aga Ashtra Kashmiri and Narayan Prasad Betab, these three stalwarts, they were given more respect than any Bollywood hero. They were the heroes of those days, because of their name the plays reign during those days. So Betab was adamant and uncompromising in his attitude, and the style of Parsi theatre that dominated in his translation. But Prithviraj Kapoor, you see, his approach was different. So he wanted to rediscover Shakuntal for a contemporary audience. So there were other experimentations. He was reading in between the lines in Kalidasa's play. So he showed Kandva witnessing the love scene between Dushyant and Shakuntala from the background, because Kandva is aware of whatever is going on in his ashrama. So he made different experimentation in his approach, and this of course it was a failure because of on one score, because of the disagreement between the script writer and the director, and there were many other things, because the audience were not so much enamored as they were enamored by the other performances of Prithviraj Kapoor, his productions of Diwar and Pathan in other places. More than 2,000 productions of each play were given, but this Shakuntal had hardly 250 repetitions. Productions in different cities. In Mumbai there were only 9 shows. In whole the country there were around 250 shows. So this was a very limited number considering the popularity of Kalidasa's.
So all these illustrations and the kind of disagreements, I think from a translation student's perspective, I think this gives us a new lead.
Right.
How can the same text can be viewed or can be presented or adapted, appropriated by different people. Sir, you have been working on this particular aspect of literature, Natya Shastra, and how it should be translated. And you have also a very recent publication, which is a very important one, Naya Sahitya Shastra. So we would also like to know as to what you really presented in this, and how the translation students should benefit from this.
This is also a very important question, a very significant issue that you have raised. In continuation of what I have been saying, I would like to conclude by saying that the journey of search for Indian identity of aesthetics in theatre, which started via Shakuntal, that continues till this day. That we can say. After Prithviraj Kapoor performed Shakuntal, there was a performance directed by Prem Shankar Narsi, who was a great stage director and one of the greatest actors that 20th century has produced. So this performance is also important in respect of what Prithviraj Kapoor wanted to achieve and couldn't, and Prem Shankar Narsi wants to continue his search for an Indian identity of aesthetics. And it is rare that your question very much becomes important, because the translations of Shakuntala and the knowledge of Natya Shastra through Kalidasa's play, because when Sir William Jones published it in his translation of Shakuntal, in his preface he wrote that unfortunately we don't have the text of Bharata's Natya Shastra. I came to know that there is a book on theatre in Sanskrit, but that is not available to us. Sir H.H. Wilson also in 1826 he wrote in his Select Specimen of Hindu Theatre that we are not in possession of Natya Shastra, such a great book on the aesthetics of theatre. Later on, when Natya Shastra was discovered, and there were attempts to read Natya Shastra in context with the theatre performance, the whole scenario again changes, because we have to re-understand the aesthetic experience through Kalidasa's play, the Sanskrit theatre, or the plays written by Bhavabhuti and other playwrights, great playwrights, and what Bharat Muni is envisaging, the system of theatre and the aesthetic experience that Bharat Muni is envisaging in his Natya Shastra, that becomes very much relevant today, because even some of the greatest theatre directors, they are now drawn towards Natya Shastra and Kalidasa or Sanskrit drama because of these translations, because we have now the text of Bharata's Natya Shastra. So Natya Shastra, since it has been now translated in French and German and English, there are many English translations available. So Sanskrit theatre is becoming more and more relevant for the contemporary world audience today through the translations of Natya Shastra and through the translations of Kalidasa's play also, we can say. And this is the importance of translations, particularly the translations of Sanskrit plays and the texts like Natya Shastra, that our attention towards the Indian identity of aesthetics, towards the search of Indian theatre, that search becomes more meaningful through these translations.
Sir, if we bring out the essence of the discussion that we had, I feel tempted to state that translation and study of translation of a text like Abhigyanshakuntalam teaches us a few lessons. That, and foremost is that translation is a means of discovering new world vision.
Right.
That Europe did not have before reading Abhigyanshakuntalam. Discovering a new theatre that European theatre did not have. Different kind of relationship between nature and man, living and non-living, that Europe had not thought of. And then different perception of aesthetic experience. For Indians like us, in the 19th century in particular, it was rediscovering our own self. And that journey of rediscovery was from different quarters, in different languages, in different art forms. And that continues, and would continue, because Shakuntala becomes the ultimate epitome of aesthetic experience and intellectual experience as well. I hope that we will continue to discuss this, because a text like this and other language texts cannot be exhausted in a small session. We would here take this opportunity to thank you. Maybe someday we shall discuss how to receive translated text in Sanskrit,
Right.
and the possibilities of research as well.
As Professor Singh has mentioned, we would like to continue, sir, this discussion. Maybe we will be extending to the non-literary text, which is the repository of the knowledge and which has also been received quite appreciatingly in the entire world. So I would like to express my heartfelt thanks to you, sir, to coming to our studios and
Thank you very
sharing
much.
your experiences and views.